"I won't leave you," Black Boy told 5 trapped bikers. 1,000 riders returned for him. Smoke doesn't knock. It just comes in under the door. 5 grown men were on their knees in a steel garage that was turning into an oven, and not one of them could get the door up. Silas Vandergriff, 58 years old, 2 tours in Vietnam behind him, a man who had walked through worse fires than this one, pressed his palm flat against the corrugated metal and felt it getting warm. "Preacher!" rasped a voice behind him. "Door ain't moving." "I know it, Duke." "Then we need another way out." "I know that too." Outside, past that jammed roller door, the Serrano Ridge fire was doing what fires do when the wind decides to help them. It was running. And on the other side of 6 inches of steel, a boy on a bicycle had just skidded to a stop in the gravel, 1 foot down, staring at a door that shouldn't have been shaking the way it was shaking. He heard a man's voice, muffled, desperate. "Somebody's out there. Hey, hey! We're trapped in here!" The boy's name was Kasim Boateng Reyes, 11 years old. Small enough that his grandmother still worried over the collar of his hoodie in the mornings, big enough in the heart that he was already off the bike and running toward a burning building before his brain had finished deciding to. That's the moment. That's where this story really starts. A boy's sneakers hitting gravel, 5 men's lives on the other side of a door that wouldn't open, and smoke rolling low and mean across a desert service road that most maps don't even bother to name. Hold on to that image. We're going to circle back to it. But first, you need to understand who this boy was, and why, when the smart thing to do was run, he didn't. 2 years earlier. Grief has a smell in the high desert. It smells like creosote after rain and diesel exhaust and the inside of a church fan blowing warm air across a folding chair. Cassie knew that smell the way other boys knew the smell of their own bedrooms. His father, Quabena Reyes, had been a long-haul trucker, the kind of man who called from a truck stop in Barstow just to hear his son breathe on the other end of the line before bed. Quabena had inherited 2 things from his own father: a name that meant born on a Tuesday in Twee, and a set of hands that could fix anything with an engine. He'd been driving a rig through the San Gabriel foothills on a gray February morning when a rock slide came down without warning and crushed the cab before he ever saw it coming. Cassie had been 9. His mother, Yolanda, a nurse's aide from the Bronx, who'd followed Quabena out west when they married, had held on for a year after that, working doubles, keeping the lights on, keeping Cassie in shoes that fit, before her own body gave out under a grief nobody warned her would sit in her chest like a stone. A weak heart, the doctors said. Cassie knew better. He knew a broken one when he saw it, because he was carrying one too. So it was Grandma Adwoa now. Adwoa Boateng, 71 years old, small and fierce, and built like she'd been carved out of the same red rock as the hills behind her single-wide trailer. She kept a Bible on the kitchen table and a tambourine by the door, because Sunday mornings she played it at Mount Zion Deliverance, the storefront church 2 towns over, and she was not going to be late for the Lord on account of anybody. "Quabena Kwame Boateng Reyes," she'd say, using his full name the way only grandmothers can, stretching it out like she was daring the world to forget it. "You come from men who fix things. You hear me? Fix things and stayed. Don't you ever be a man who runs." Because he didn't fully understand what she meant back then. He understood it with his whole chest later in the smoke. What she was really talking about, though she never said his name outright, not for years, was Casey's grandfather, Adwoa's late husband, Kwame Boateng, a mechanic from Kumasi, Ghana, who'd immigrated in his 20s, joined the army because it was the fastest path to citizenship for a man with steady hands and no money, and shipped out to Vietnam in 1968 as a maintenance sergeant attached to a transport unit. Kwame never talked about the war, not once, not to Adwoa, not to his own son. All she knew, all anyone knew, was that he came home with a bronze star he kept in a sock drawer and a habit of flinching at the sound of a truck backfiring for the rest of his life. He died of a heart attack in 1995, working under a Chevy pickup in his own driveway before Cassie was even born. What Adwoa never told anyone, not even her own son while he was living, was the one letter Kwame had written and never sent. Folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, tucked behind the lining of his old army footlocker, where she found it 3 days after his funeral. It wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to a family he'd never met. The family of a man named Silas, a young private he'd pulled out of a burning truck outside a village whose name Kwame could never bring himself to say out loud. The letter said, in Kwame's careful, self-taught English, "I do not know if he lived past that day. If he did, I hope somebody in his life knows what kind of man was riding beside him. If he did not, I hope his mother knows he called for her, and that I stayed until I could not stay anymore." Adwoa had read that letter exactly once and then put it away, because grief has to be rationed in a house that still has bills to pay and a boy to raise, and some griefs you set down gently and pick back up only when the Lord decides it's time. She didn't know, sitting at her kitchen table that morning with the radio murmuring about a fire out past the old fuel depot, that the Lord's timing had arrived. She only knew her grandson wasn't answering his phone. What Casey carried. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a boy who has buried two parents before the age of 10. It isn't sadness exactly. Sadness comes and goes, rises and falls like weather. This was something under the weather, a stillness. Teachers at his new middle school had already started passing notes about it in the staff room. Withdrawn, doesn't engage, keeps to himself at lunch. The way schools do when they've decided a child's grief is a behavioral problem rather than a wound still bleeding. Only 2 people had ever gotten past that stillness. One was Grandma Adwoa, who fed it patiently with cornbread and scripture and the tambourine on Sundays, never asking him to perform happiness he didn't feel, just making sure he knew there was a place at her table whether he talked or not. The other was a bicycle. Casey's father had left behind exactly one gift with any weight to it, an old 10-speed he'd been restoring in the driveway before the rock slide, half stripped down to bare metal, waiting on a chain he never got to buy. Adwoa had scraped together the money for that chain herself from her Social Security check 6 months after the funeral and presented it to Cassie without a word, just set the little paper bag from the hardware store on his bed and walked out of the room so he could cry about it in private if he needed to. He hadn't cried. He'd gone straight to the garage and started working, because that was the only language his father had ever really taught him. Not words, but the quiet grammar of a wrench turning, a bolt seating home, a problem taken apart piece by piece, until it made sense again. By the time he finished, 3 weeks later, he had a bicycle that ran smoother than half the bikes the other kids' parents bought new at the big box store in Victorville. And every Saturday since, he rode it. Out past the trailer park, out past the last paved road, into the tangle of gravel access lanes and service roads that laced through the scrub behind the old Halloran fuel depot. Not because there was anything out there worth seeing, but because the wind in his ears was the closest thing he had left to his father's voice. He was 3 miles into that Saturday ride, no particular destination, when the smell of smoke reached him on the wind, sharp, close, wrong in a way that made the small hairs on his arms stand up before his brain caught up to what his body already knew. That's the boy who rounded the bend into the smoke. Not a hero looking for a headline. A kid who couldn't stand the sound of somebody calling for help and not answering because he knew exactly what it felt like to be the one who needed an answer and didn't get one. Inside the garage, to understand why 5 grown men, combat veterans, every one of them, men who had stared down worse than a jammed door in their lives, were on their knees praying instead of kicking the thing down, you have to understand what that garage actually was. It wasn't just storage. It was the clubhouse annex of the Iron Widows Riding Club, a small motorcycle fellowship of aging veterans who'd banded together 15 years earlier, for the oldest reason men like them ever band together, because the silence after service is loud, and a garage full of engines and brothers who understood without asking is quieter than an empty house. Silas Preacher Vandergriff had founded it. 68 years old now, built like a fence post that had weathered 50 winters and was still standing out of pure stubbornness. He'd earned the nickname not from any pulpit, but from a habit of saying grace before every ride out loud, whether the other riders wanted to hear it or not. Lord, watch the road, watch the wind, and watch the fool who thinks he don't need you to do either. Beside him that morning, Duke Okafor, 61, a retired ATF investigator with a laugh like a shotgun blast and a limp from a knee that never healed right after a motorcycle accident in '09. Ray Tolliver, 70, the quietest of the 5, who hadn't spoken more than 50 words a day since his wife passed and let his engine say the rest. Big Marcus. No, they'd renamed him years ago because there was already a Marcus in the club, so he went by Whistler on account of a low, constant, tuneless whistle he did without noticing. A habit from 3 tours that nobody had the heart to ask him about. And the youngest of them, 54-year-old Teodoro Teo Salcedo, who'd joined the club 2 years back after his own son stopped speaking to him and the silence at home got to be too much. They'd come out that morning to check on a shipment of parts they kept stored in the annex. Old carburetors, a salvaged frame Duke was restoring, nothing worth dying for, and the fire had simply moved faster than any of them expected. By the time they realized the smoke wasn't just drifting through from a controlled burn somewhere over the ridge, the roller door's motor had already died, tripped by the same power surge that killed 3 transformers along the county line, and the manual release had rusted shut from disuse. "We should have replaced that override years ago," Duke had muttered, coughing, throwing his shoulder against the door for the fourth useless time. "Should've, would've," Preacher said, low. "Ain't the time for that sermon, Duke." It was Whistler who heard the bicycle tires skidding in the gravel outside, heard them over his own whistling, over the crackle of the fire climbing the ridge behind them, and grabbed Preacher's arm. "Somebody's out there!" Preacher had pressed his eye to the gap under the door and seen a pair of small sneakers, a kid's sneakers, and felt something close to despair. Because the last thing he wanted, at the end of everything, was for a child to die trying to save 5 old men who'd already lived their lives. "Kid, get back! This whole thing could go up! Get back!" He meant it. Every word. He'd meant it with his whole chest. The boy hadn't listened. And something about that, something about a child choosing to stay when 5 grown men were begging him to run, cracked something open in Silas Vandergrift that had been sealed shut since a hillside outside a village he could never bring himself to name. 57 years and half a world away, when another man had made exactly the same choice for him. Cassie had never met either of his grandfathers, but he wore something that belonged to one of them, a dog tag on a ball chain tucked under his shirt, cool against his sternum. Adwoa had given it to him the week after his mother's funeral, pressed it into his palm without ceremony. "This was your grandfather's," she'd said. "He didn't talk much about the war. But he told me one thing. One time, and I never forgot it." She looked at Casey with an intensity that scared him a little. "He said the only thing that matters in a fire is whether you stayed." Casey didn't know what that meant then either. He was about to find out. The morning the sky turned orange. The Serrano Ridge fire started small, a spark off a power line. The kind of thing that happens a dozen times a season in dry country and usually gets stomped out before the news even hears about it. Except this time, the wind had other plans. By 10 in the morning, it had jumped the first containment line. By noon, it was racing down the eastern slope toward the service road that ran behind the old Halloran fuel and storage lot. A stretch of land nobody much thought about. 3 corrugated steel garages and a chain-link fence, half a mile from the nearest fire hydrant. Cassie had been out on his bike since sunup, the way he was most Saturdays, cutting through back lots and access roads because it was faster than the highway, and because riding fast was the only thing that made the quiet in his chest go quiet, too. He smelled the smoke before he saw it. That particular burnt copper smell that means it's close, not far. He should have turned around right then. Any sensible kid would have. Instead, he pedaled toward it, because there were voices in it, and voices meant people, and people meant somebody might need help the way his daddy had needed help on that gray February morning, and nobody had been close enough to give it. He rounded the last bend in the service road, and there it was, a squat steel garage, its roller door jammed halfway up on a bent track, thick gray smoke pouring out from underneath it like the building itself was exhaling its last breath. And behind that half-open gap, he could see boots, legs, men on their knees. "Hey!" Cassie screamed, dropping his bike so hard the front wheel spun uselessly in the gravel. "Hey, I see you!" A face appeared in the gap. An old white man, beard gone gray-white, eyes red from smoke, blood on his forehead from where he'd cracked it trying to force the door up with his bare hands. Kid, get back! This whole thing could go up! Get back! What's wrong with the door?" "Motor's dead! The track's bent! We can't—" The man coughed, hard, doubled over. "Just run! You hear me? Go get somebody! Go get help! Don't you dare!" That's when Cassie saw it. Bolted to the side of the housing, half hidden by a rusted junction box, a manual override crank. Old, ugly. The kind of thing installed 30 years ago and never used since, because why would you, when the motor worked fine? Except the motor didn't work fine. Not today. "There's a crank!" Cassie shouted, already scrambling toward it. "There's a manual crank! Hold on! Hold on!" "Boy, that thing's rusted solid. It hasn't turned in years. You need to—" Cassie wasn't listening anymore. His hands found the iron handle, cold despite the heat pressing in from everywhere else, and he threw his whole 81 pounds into turning it. It didn't move. He tried again. Nothing. His palms were already stinging, the rust biting into skin that had never done a day of real labor in its life. Behind the door, he could hear the men. 5 of them now, he realized, 5 voices, and one was praying, actually praying, low and fast, the way Grandma Adwoa prayed when the ambulance came for his mother. "Come on," Casey hissed through his teeth, planting his feet wide the way he'd seen his father brace against a stuck lug nut 100 times. Fixed things and stayed. "Come on, come on, come on!" Something gave. Not much. An inch. A groan of metal that hadn't moved in decades, finally admitting it could. "It's moving!" the bearded man shouted, and now there were more faces crowding the gap, more hands trying to help push from the inside, even though there was nothing on their side to grip. "Keep going, kid. Keep going." "Preacher! We don't even know his name!" one of the other men wheezed. "Don't matter what his name is," the bearded man, Preacher, snapped back, voice cracking with smoke and something that wasn't smoke at all. "Matters that he didn't run." Cassie turned that crank until his palms split open and he didn't feel it, didn't feel any of it, because somewhere in the middle of that iron groaning and that smoke thickening and those men's voices rising, something in him had locked into place the exact same way it had locked into place the day his father's truck didn't come home. A decision that didn't feel like a decision at all. It just felt like the only thing a person could do. The door had risen maybe 18 inches. Enough for smoke to pour out in a solid gray wall, not enough for a man to fit through. "I need..." Cassie gasped. "I need more." And that's when the second sound arrived. Not the fire, not the men. Tires on gravel, fast, and a spotlight swinging across the smoke even though it was broad daylight, and a voice through a cruiser's PA system that cut through everything else in the world. "Step away from the building! Step away right now!" Cassie didn't step away. He kept turning. The cruiser door slammed, boots hit gravel. A deputy, young, jaw set hard, hand already resting on his belt in a way that made something in Cassie's stomach drop even through the smoke, was striding toward him with an expression that wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude, it was suspicion, plain and immediate, the kind that had already decided what it was looking at before it had bothered to actually look. "Kid, get away from there! What did you do to that door?" "I'm not doing anything to it," Casey shouted back, still cranking, still bleeding into rusted iron. "I'm trying to get it open. There's people trapped." "Step back. Now! There's 5 men in there." The deputy's hand closed around Cassie's shoulder. Not gentle, not the way you'd pull a child back from danger, but the way you'd yank a suspect off a fence, and hauled him bodily away from the crank just as, behind that steel door, Preacher Vandergrift's voice rose one more time, hoarse and furious and pleading all at once. "Don't you touch that boy! He's the only reason we're still breathing in here!" The deputy froze, hand still locked on Casey's shoulder, smoke rolling between them, and the door jammed at 18 inches, holding at 18 inches, a gap too small for a grown man and too large to ignore, hung there in the gray light like a held breath. Somewhere down the service road, more sirens were coming. A TV van, catching wind of the fire early, was already rerouting toward the smoke column. And a fire marshal 3 counties over, watching a drone feed of the blaze from his office, because he had personal reasons to be watching this particular stretch of land, felt his stomach drop when he saw a county cruiser's lights pull into frame. None of them knew yet what this boy's name was. None of them knew what he was about to become to 5 old strangers, or what those 5 old strangers were about to mean to him. But the crank was still warm from his hands. And it wasn't over. The gap under that door held at 18 inches for what felt, to everyone standing in that smoke, like an entire lifetime. Deputy Wade Kerrigan still had his hand locked around Casey's shoulder when the second cruiser arrived, and then the first fire engine. County volunteer, undermanned, coming from the wrong direction because the dispatch call had gone out garbled. And then trailing all of it by 90 seconds, a white news van with a satellite dish already unfolding on its roof before the vehicle had even stopped rolling. "Sir, I need you to let go of him." The voice belonged to a firefighter, mask pushed up on his forehead, already sizing up the jammed door with the flat, fast calculation of a man who'd seen worse and knew better than to panic in front of civilians. "Now. We've got 5 confirmed inside." Kerrigan let go. Not gently. More like he'd forgotten his hand was there at all, his attention snapping instead toward the news van, toward the growing knot of onlookers who'd started gathering at the mouth of the service road, the way people do when smoke rises over a small town. Drawn by something primal that has nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with needing to know the danger isn't coming for you next. Because it didn't wait to be told what to do. The second Kerrigan's grip loosened, he was back at the crank, palms screaming, and this time a firefighter dropped down beside him without a word and added his own gloved hands to the handle. "On 3, the firefighter said. 1, 2. The door groaned up another 8 inches, then a foot. Enough, finally, for Duke Okafor to fold himself nearly in half and drag his body through the gap, coughing so hard he doubled over the second his boots hit open air, then turned immediately back toward the opening to help pull the next man through. Whistler came out low and fast, then Teo, half-carrying Ray, whose ankle had turned wrong in the scramble to get low beneath the smoke, and last, because that was who he was, and everyone who knew him would have told you there was no other order it could have gone in. Silas Vandergrift came through the gap on his hands and knees, lungs raw, and the first thing he did once he was clear, before he even let the paramedics near him, was twist around looking for the boy. "Where is he?" Preacher rasped, grabbing the nearest firefighter's arm hard enough to leave a mark. "The kid! Where's the kid who—" "Right here, sir. He's fine. We've got him. I want to see him." They brought Cassie over, soot-streaked, hands wrapped hastily in gauze by a paramedic who kept trying to get him to sit still on the back bumper of an ambulance and failing. And Silas Vandergrift, 68 years old, a man who had buried more friends than he could count on both hands and both feet, looked at that boy like he was looking at something he didn't have language for yet. "What's your name?" "Son?" "Cassie." His voice came out smaller than he meant it to. "Kasim. Boateng Reyes." Something flickered across Silas's face at the name. Quick, gone before anyone could read it, filed away the way a man files away a splinter he doesn't have time to dig out yet. He'd heard names like that before, a long time ago, on the other side of the world. "Well, Kasim Boateng Reyes," Silas said, and his voice cracked clean down the middle. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Cassie said. "You could have run." "I know that too." "Why didn't you?" Cassie looked down at his bandaged hands, at the blood already soaking faint pink through the white gauze, and said the only thing that had ever made sense to him about any of it. "Because you were still in there." Nobody standing in that gravel lot said anything for a long moment. Not the firefighters, not the paramedics, not even Deputy Kerrigan, who had drifted back toward the edge of the scene with an expression that had curdled from suspicion into something closer to shame, though he wasn't ready to name it that yet. It was the reporter who broke the silence. The man with the microphone. Marlon Beaufort Kite had been chasing anchor desks for 11 years and hadn't landed one yet, and he had convinced himself, somewhere around year 8, that the reason wasn't talent. It was that he'd never had the story, the one that broke big, the one that got picked up by the network affiliates and put his face on a screen bigger than the regional Tuesday night slot he'd been stuck in since he graduated journalism school with more ambition than sense. He smelled it the second he stepped out of the van. "Get the bikers!" he hissed to his cameraman, already smoothing his jacket, already composing the lead in his head. "Get them while they're still coughing. That's good television. Coughing sells authenticity." "What about the kid?" Marlon glanced over at Cassie, small, dark-skinned, wrapped in a paramedic's blanket, half hidden behind the ambulance, and made a calculation so fast and so casual that he never even registered it as a decision. He'd covered enough small-town stories to know, with the cold instinct of a man who'd learned to read a market rather than a moment, exactly which face this particular audience wanted leading the 6 o'clock broadcast, and it wasn't going to be an 11-year-old black kid with a bicycle. "We'll get him in the background. Wide shot's fine." He was already moving toward Silas. "Focus on the bikers. Brotherhood beats the blaze. That's the headline. That's the hook. 5 veterans, a fire, a rescue." "Sir, actually it was the kid who—" "Wide shot," Marlon said again, sharper, already thrusting his microphone toward Preacher Vandergrift with a smile switched on like a light fixture. Sir, can you tell our viewers what happened here today? 5 of you trapped, and against all odds—" "Against all odds, nothing," Silas snapped, and something in his tone made Marlon actually flinch, made the cameraman's lens waver for the first time all afternoon. "You want the story? There's the story." He turned, pointed one shaking finger directly at Casey. "That boy right there turned a hand crank that hadn't moved in 30 years until his palm split open because he heard grown men calling for help and he didn't run. You put him on your 6 o'clock. Not me. Him." Marlon's smile didn't falter. That was the thing about men like Marlon. Their smiles were load-bearing structures that didn't come down for anything short of a building collapsing on them directly. But his eyes did a fast, calculating recalculation, weighing what Silas had just said against what he still believed his viewers actually wanted to see. "We'll absolutely feature the young man," he said smoothly, already turning back to the camera, "as part of the broader story of community heroism here today." "That's not what I said," Silas growled. But Marlon had already moved on, already cueing the cameraman for his stand-up, already building a narrative in real time that would, by 6:15 that evening, air across 3 counties with barely 90 seconds devoted to a local boy who was never once shown speaking, never once named on camera, his face blurred at the studio's editorial discretion, to protect the identity of a minor, a courtesy nobody had bothered to extend by asking Cassie or his grandmother whether they wanted it. By the time the broadcast aired, the headline read, 5 veterans escape blaze in dramatic rescue. Kasi's name appeared nowhere in it. Adwoa hears Adwoa Boateng was standing in her kitchen with the radio on low, humming along to a gospel station out of San Bernardino, when the announcer broke in with a fire bulletin, Serrano Ridge Fire, evacuation advisory for the Route 138 corridor, residents urged to shelter in place or evacuate south. And something in her chest went cold and still, the particular stillness of a grandmother who has already buried a son and a daughter-in-law and knows in her bones exactly how fast the world can take one more thing from her. She called Casey's cell phone. No answer. She called again. No answer. She was already reaching for her car keys, already praying out loud in the empty kitchen the way she'd prayed the night the sheriff came to her door 2 years ago. Lord, not again, Lord, I cannot do this again. When her neighbor, Miss Ruthie from the diner 2 lots down, came pounding on her screen door, phone held out, screen glowing. Adwoa, Adwoa, turn on the television right now. What Adwoa saw on that screen wasn't her grandson's face. It was a blurred shape in a paramedic's blanket, half-cropped out of frame, while 5 bearded white men stood front and center telling a reporter how lucky they were to be alive. But Adwoa Boateng had raised that boy from the time he was 9 years old. She knew the shape of his shoulders from across a football field. She knew that hoodie, the blue one, the one she'd bought him at the church clothing drive because it was the only one in his size. And she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with news broadcasts and everything to do with 71 years of a mother's instinct, exactly who that blurred shape belonged to. She was in her car before the segment finished airing. The fire marshal's sweat, 60 miles away in an office with the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. Cyrus Dalton Halloran watched the same broadcast on a muted television while scrolling through drone footage on his laptop and felt a bead of sweat travel slow and cold down the center of his back, despite the air conditioning running full blast. Cyrus was the county fire marshal. He was also, less publicly, a silent partner in a development company that had spent the better part of 2 years trying to acquire the parcel of land the Iron Widow's garage sat on. 3 acres of scrubland his own company had appraised quietly as perfect for a truck stop plaza that would service the growing freight corridor along Route 138. The garage and the annex behind it were the only structures standing between his partners and a signed deal. He hadn't started the fire. He wanted that on record, in his own head, over and over, the way a man rehearses a defense he hopes he'll never need to give out loud. He hadn't started it. But he had, 11 months ago, quietly deprioritized a fire mitigation request for that exact corridor, a controlled burn clearance and brush removal order that would have thinned the fuel load around the Halloran Depot property, an order that had been sitting in triplicate on a subordinate's desk because Cyrus had told that subordinate, off the record, that the budget needed to go elsewhere this quarter. He watched the footage of 5 men stumbling out of that garage alive and told himself it didn't matter now. Nobody died. Nobody was hurt bad enough to matter. This would blow over the way these things always blew over. Then he watched it a second time, frame by frame, and noticed something the first pass had missed. A boy. A small boy in a blue hoodie turning a rusted iron crank with his bare hands, while 5 grown men who by rights should have been dead were instead climbing out of a building that Cyrus's own negligence had turned into a coffin waiting to close. Cyrus Halloran had built a career on the careful management of what people saw and what they didn't. He understood, with the particular clarity of a guilty man watching a story start to write itself without his permission, that this was no longer a fire report he could bury in triplicate. This was a boy who wouldn't leave 5 strangers to die. And boys like that, Cyrus knew, with a dread that settled into his stomach like a stone dropped down a well, had a way of becoming exactly the kind of story that gets people asking questions. Preacher's question. At Desert Valley Medical Center, in a curtained bay smelling of antiseptic and smoke that no amount of soap could fully scrub off his skin, Silas Vandergriff lay on a gurney with an oxygen line under his nose and refused, 3 separate times, to let the nurse sedate him for observation. "I need to talk to that boy," he kept saying, voice raw as sandpaper. "Where'd they take the boy?" "Mr. Vandergriff, you need to rest." "I don't need rest, I need to know where they took Kasim." He tried to sit up and the nurse pressed him firmly back down. "Kasim Boateng Reyes, somebody find out where they took him." Duke Okafor, in the next bay over, still coughing but stable, caught the name through the thin curtain and went quiet in a way that made Whistler, sitting beside him, absently whistling a tune nobody could place, stop mid-note. "Preacher," Duke called through the curtain, slow, careful. "You all right over there?" "Boateng," Silas said again, half to himself, half to the ceiling, like he was testing the weight of the word. You hear that name, Duke? A long pause. I heard it. Same as... I heard it, preacher. Neither man said the rest of it out loud, not yet, not in a hospital bay with a curtain thin enough for anyone to overhear. But something had shifted in the room, something neither of them could have explained to a stranger. A current running underneath the antiseptic smell and the beeping monitors that pulled both their minds 57 years backward, to a hillside outside a village whose name still caught in Silas Vandergrift's throat every single time he tried to say it out loud. He hadn't seen the boy's face clearly enough in the smoke and the chaos to know for certain. He told himself it was probably nothing. Boateng wasn't that rare a name, not in a country as big as this one, not with as many people from as many places as had come through it. But he lay there on that gurney with his heart hammering harder than the fire had ever made it hammer, and he thought about a letter he'd written himself decades ago, to a family he'd never had the courage to actually track down and send it to. A letter thanking a man named Kwame Boateng for pulling him out of a burning truck and never once explaining why he'd stayed instead of running the way any sane man would have. The only thing that matters in a fire is whether you stayed. Silas hadn't heard those exact words out loud in 57 years. He'd only ever heard them in his own head, in his own memory of a mechanic's calm, steady voice telling him to hold still while flames climbed the canvas awning 6 feet away. He didn't know yet that a boy wearing his grandfather's dog tag was, at that exact moment, sitting in an ambulance bay 3 hallways away, refusing to let anyone throw away a bandage stained with his own blood because Grandma Adwoa always said, "You don't waste what it cost you something to give." He didn't know yet, but something in his chest already did. Kerrigan's reckoning begun. Deputy Wade. Kerrigan sat in his cruiser in the hospital parking lot for 11 minutes before he could make himself go inside, replaying the moment his hand had closed around a child's shoulder and yanked him backward like a suspect fleeing a scene, replaying the assumption he'd made in the half-second before he'd even bothered to ask a single question. He'd grown up in this county. He'd grown up hearing his own father talk about outsiders moving into the desert towns, about keeping an eye on certain families, certain neighborhoods, certain kinds of names. Talk Wade had absorbed the way a kid absorbs anything repeated often enough at his own dinner table without ever examining it, without ever once asking himself where the assumption actually came from, or whether it had any right to still be living in him at 34 years old. He'd seen a black boy at the scene of a fire on a stretch of land he half remembered his father grumbling about, that Halloran land ought to be something better out there than a bunch of old bikers and squatters. And some old, unexamined circuit in his brain had fired before his training ever got the chance to. He didn't have the words yet for what he was feeling sitting in that parking lot. Shame was close to it. So was fear. Fear of what it meant about him, about the badge on his chest, that his first instinct at a child's greatest act of courage had been suspicion instead of gratitude. He was still sitting there, engine off, hands on the wheel, when Adwoa Boateng's car came tearing into the lot at a speed that would, on any other day, have earned her a ticket, and she was out of the driver's seat and running for the emergency room doors before the engine had even finished ticking down. Kerrigan watched her go. And for reasons he couldn't fully articulate even to himself, he got out of his cruiser and followed her in, because some part of him, buried under 34 years of inherited assumptions, understood that he owed that family an apology, and that finding the courage to give it was going to be the harder rescue of the day. The cliffhanger inside the hospital, Cassie sat on the edge of an exam table, hands freshly rebandaged, staring at nothing in particular. When the curtain swept back and his grandmother's face appeared, tear-streaked, furious with relief, already pulling him into an embrace so tight it nearly knocked the wind out of him. "Don't you ever," Adwoa said into his hair, voice shaking. "Don't you ever scare me like that again? You understand me? Baby, don't you ever—" "I'm okay, Grandma, I'm okay. I saw the television, I saw them not even say your name." Before Casey could answer, the curtain moved again. A nurse, apologetic, poking her head through. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but there's a patient 2 bays down, an older gentleman, one of the men from the fire. He's been asking for your grandson by name for the last 20 minutes, and he won't calm down until somebody lets him see him. Says it's urgent. Says—" The nurse hesitated, checking a note in her hand like she wasn't sure she was reading it right. "He says it's about a debt he's owed for 57 years. Adwoa went very still. Cassie looked up at her, confused. "Grandma? What's she talking about?" But Adwoa Boateng wasn't looking at the nurse anymore. She was looking down at the ball chain just visible at the collar of her grandson's hospital gown. At the dog tag she'd pressed into his palm 2 years ago without ever fully explaining where it came from or why. Some nights, she still took it out of its little velvet pouch in her dresser drawer and held it and cried for a man she'd loved for 30 years and lost too soon. "I don't know, baby," she whispered, though something in her voice suggested she was beginning, for the very first time in 57 years, to suspect exactly what it meant. "Take us to him," she told the nurse. And 2 hallways away, in a curtained bay with an oxygen line under his nose, Silas Vandergriff heard footsteps approaching and felt his heart climb into his throat because he was about to find out whether the debt he'd carried for 57 years, a debt he'd never known how to repay, to a man he'd never been able to find, had just walked back into his life wearing a blue hoodie and a dead man's dog tags. Silas Vandergriff heard the footsteps before he saw them, and his whole body went taut against the thin hospital mattress like a man bracing for a blow he'd been waiting 57 years to receive. The curtain drew back. A nurse first, then Adwoa Boateng, one hand resting protectively on her grandson's shoulder, and then Kasi himself, small in his hospital gown, dog tag still visible at his collar where the fabric had shifted loose. Silas looked at the boy's face first, really looked, the way he hadn't been able to in the smoke and chaos of the fire, and something in his chest folded in on itself. Then his eyes dropped to the chain around the boy's neck, and he stopped breathing entirely. "Where did you get that?" Silas said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the sterile hum of the hospital bay like a struck bell. "That dog tag. Son, where did you get that?" Casey's hand went instinctively to his collar, covering it the way he always did when a stranger noticed. "It was my grandfather's." "What was his name?" Adwoa's grip on Casey's shoulder tightened. She could see plainly where this was going, and 71 years of a life spent watching the Lord's timing arrive exactly when it was needed had taught her not to interrupt it once it started moving. "Kwame," Kasi said. "Kwame Boateng. He was in the army. He died before I was born." Silas Vandergriff, a man who had walked out of a burning transport truck 57 years ago and had not cried about it once in all the decades since, not at the funeral of his own mother, not at his divorce, not at the graveside of 3 separate brothers from his unit, put both hands over his face and wept. "I've been looking for that man's family," he said, muffled, shaking, "for 57 years. I didn't know his name most of that time. Nobody would tell me, records sealed, units scattered to the 4 winds, and I never had the courage to push hard enough to find out, because I didn't know what I'd say if I found them. I didn't know how you thank somebody for a life you've had 57 years to fill up when he never got the chance to fill up his own." He lowered his hands. His eyes, red-rimmed and wet, fixed on Casey with an intensity that made the boy take half a step backward into his grandmother's side. "Your grandfather pulled me out of a burning truck outside a village I still can't make my mouth say the name of. Deuce and a half, tires blown, fuel line caught. I was pinned under the tailgate. Everybody else was already clear, already running, and your grandfather, Sergeant Kwame Boateng, a maintenance man, not even combat infantry, wasn't even his job to be anywhere near that truck, turned around and came back for me. Burned his hands doing it. Never once talked about it afterward, not to me, not to anybody. Best I ever heard." Adwoa made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob, and sat down hard in the plastic chair beside the gurney, because she was hearing, for the first time in her life, the other half of a story her husband had carried silently to his grave, the half he'd folded into a letter he never sent, the half she'd only ever glimpsed in the way he flinched at a truck backfiring 30 years after the war had ended for everyone else but him. "He wrote a letter," she said, barely above a whisper. "I found it after he passed, never sent it. Addressed to a family he never found, said," her voice caught, "said he hoped somebody in that man's life knew what kind of man had been riding beside him." Silas Vandergriff closed his eyes. "I'm the man," he said. "I'm the one he was riding beside." The room went very quiet. Outside the curtain, hospital machinery beeped its steady rhythm, oblivious to the fact that a debt 57 years in the carrying had just, in the space of 90 seconds, come due. "Your grandfather saved my life," Silas said, opening his eyes, looking at Casey now with something that had shifted from grief into a fierce, unshakable resolve. "And today, his grandson saved mine, and 4 other men's lives besides, with nothing but a rusted crank and a set of hands too small for the job. You understand what that means, son? You understand what kind of family you come from?" Casey, still 11 years old, still holding a grief too big for his body most days, didn't have words for what he was feeling. He just nodded and let the old man reach out and take his bandaged hand as gently as if it were made of glass. "I won't leave you either," Silas said. "Not now. Not ever. You hear me?" The phone tree begins. Word travels fast in a motorcycle club. It travels faster when the word is about a debt of honor finally being paid. By the time Silas Vandergriff was discharged the following morning, against doctor's orders, checked out early because he refused to spend one more hour in a bed when there was work to be done, he had already made 4 phone calls from his hospital room, and each of those calls had made 4 more, and the mathematics of loyalty among men who ride together had begun to compound in a way that no algorithm could have predicted. Ride for Kasi. That was the message. 3 words, passed rider to rider, chapter to chapter, across a network of motorcycle clubs and veterans associations that stretched from the high desert all the way to Oakland in the north and San Diego in the south. Some of the men and women who received that message had never met Silas Vandergriff in person. Some had never heard of the Iron Widows. It didn't matter. In that world, a boy who wouldn't leave 5 strangers in a burning building was a story that needed no further explanation, and an old debt between a black GI and a white private, carried honorably for 57 years, was the kind of thing bikers understood in their bones. Because most of them had debts of their own, they were still trying to figure out how to pay. Duke Okafor, once his coughing settled enough to think straight, made a call of his own to a former colleague at the ATF, a woman named Priscilla Nwosu, who still had contacts in fire investigation and knew exactly how to pull a permit history. Within 2 days, that pulled history showed something that made Priscilla's eyebrows climb toward her hairline. A fire mitigation clearance request for the Route 138 corridor, submitted 11 months prior, deprioritized and buried under a budget note with Cyrus Halloran's initials on the reallocation memo. "Preacher," Duke said over the phone, voice grim. "You're not gonna like this. Tell me anyway." Man had a financial interest in that land staying undeveloped just long enough for a specific deal to close, and he sat on a brush clearance order that would have stopped this fire from ever getting close enough to trap us in that garage in the first place. Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had none of the raw grief from the hospital bay in it. It had something colder and steadier. "Send it to Priscilla's old office, official channels. We do this right, not for revenge, for the truth." Marlin's correction. The story Marlin Beaufort Kite had aired. 5 veterans escape blaze in dramatic rescue. Casey cropped to a blurred shadow at the edge of the frame, had a half-life of exactly 31 hours before it collapsed under its own dishonesty. It started with a single tweet. A bystander who'd been at the scene, someone who'd watched the whole thing unfold from behind the chain-link fence, posted a shaky 10-second video clip showing a small boy in a blue hoodie cranking a rusted iron handle while smoke poured out around him, captioned simply, "This is who actually saved those men." Why isn't the news naming him? It didn't go viral instantly. Nothing that matters ever does, not really. It built the way a fire builds, one ember catching the next. A local radio host picked it up. Then a young reporter named Jendayi Fontaine, a stringer for the Victorville Daily Press who covered the high desert beat because nobody else at the paper wanted the long drives, saw the clip, saw the mismatch between what actually happened and what had aired, and made exactly 1 phone call to Adwoa Boateng, whose name and number she got from a cousin who attended Mount Zion Deliverance. "Mrs. Boateng," Jendayi said once Adwoa picked up, "I'd like to tell your grandson's story the way it actually happened. Not a wide shot, not a blur. If you and Kasim are willing, I want his name in the first sentence." Adwoa had cried on the phone, right there in her kitchen, because somebody had finally asked instead of assumed. Jendayi's piece ran 2 days later, under the headline, "The Boy Who Wouldn't Leave." How an 11-year-old's bare hand saved 5 lives on Route 138. 600 words that named Kasi first, last, and everywhere in between. That quoted Silas Vandergriff at length about a 57-year-old debt of honor. That included a photograph Adwoa had provided of her husband Kwame in his army uniform, young and solemn. Standing beside a photograph Silas had provided of himself at the same age, the 2 men who'd never met framed side by side across 60 years. It went everywhere. Not because it was flashy, it wasn't. It went everywhere because it was true, and true things, when they're finally told plainly and given room to breathe, have a gravity that manufactured stories can never quite manage. Marlin Kite watched his own station's ratings dip that week for the first time in a quarter, watched the affiliate's social media flooded with comments asking why they hadn't led with the real story, and was called into his news director's office on a Thursday afternoon for a conversation that ended with him being reassigned to the overnight traffic desk. Not fired, nothing so dramatic, just quietly moved to a slot where his instincts for what a story needed would do considerably less damage. He never apologized to Cassie directly. Some men never do. But the correction ran anyway, in the paper that mattered, written by the reporter who'd bothered to ask a name instead of assuming a blur. Kerrigan comes back. Deputy Wade Kerrigan returned to the Boateng trailer 3 days after the fire, out of uniform, standing awkwardly on the little wooden step with his hat in his actual hands, which was a phrase Adwoa had only ever heard in old westerns and never expected to see performed in real life on her own front porch. "Mrs. Boateng," he said, "I owe your grandson an apology. I owe you one, too." Adwoa studied him for a long moment through the screen door before she opened it. She had buried a son. She had buried a daughter-in-law. She had raised a grandson who nearly died, proving a kindness that most grown men in this county had never once extended to him without being shamed into it first. She was not, by nature, a woman inclined toward easy forgiveness for its own sake. But she was a church-going woman, and she believed, had built her whole life around believing, that grace extended honestly and received humbly was one of the few forces in this world stronger than fire. "Come in, Deputy," she said. "Kasim's in the back. You can tell him yourself." Kerrigan sat at the little kitchen table across from an 11-year-old boy with bandaged hands and said the truest thing he'd said out loud in longer than he could remember. "I grabbed you like you'd done something wrong, when what you'd done was the bravest thing I've seen in 11 years wearing this badge. I did that because of something in me I never bothered to look at closely enough. I'm looking at it now, and I'm sorry. Truly and completely sorry." Cassie, who had inherited his grandmother's plain-spoken honesty, along with her stubborn refusal to hold a grudge past its usefulness, studied the deputy for a moment, and then said simply, "Okay, thank you for saying it." It wasn't absolution exactly. It was something more useful than absolution. A start. Kerrigan's own chief, once the full story broke and the department's initial handling of the scene came under scrutiny, called a press conference 2 weeks later and stood in front of local cameras to say, without euphemism, that Deputy Kerrigan's initial response to the child at the center of the rescue did not meet the standard the department expects, and the department is taking that seriously, including implementing new bias awareness training county-wide. Kerrigan stood beside his chief through the whole statement, in uniform, and did not flinch once, because a man who's finally looking at himself honestly doesn't get to look away just because the room is watching. The confrontation, Cyrus Dalton Halloran's undoing, did not come with sirens or handcuffs on the evening news. It came the way these things usually come for men like him, quietly, through paperwork, through a subpoena delivered to his office by a county process server on an unremarkable Tuesday morning while his secretary was still brewing the coffee. The federal investigation Duke Okafor's old contact had opened moved with the particular relentlessness of people who'd spent careers following exactly this kind of trail. Financial disclosures, land records, the buried memo with Cyrus's initials on the budget reallocation that had deprioritized a fire mitigation order 11 months before the Serrano Ridge fire tore through a corridor that clearance order would have protected. He was not charged with arson. He hadn't set the fire, and nothing in the investigation ever suggested otherwise. But the charge that did stick, criminal negligence in the performance of public safety duties compounded by an undisclosed financial conflict of interest, was in some ways a harder thing to explain away, because it wasn't a single dramatic act of villainy. It was a slow, ordinary betrayal, the kind built out of memos and reallocations, and a man convincing himself, one small decision at a time, that his own interests and the public's could be quietly kept separate in his mind, even while they collided in the real world. Silas Vandergriff was invited, as one of the 5 men directly endangered by the deprioritized clearance, to give a statement at Cyrus's administrative hearing before the county board. He stood at the podium in his cleanest vest, the one with the Iron Widow's patch stitched carefully by his own late wife decades before. And he did not rage. He did not perform outrage for the cameras that had, by then, started showing up in numbers for anything connected to this story. "I've been angry plenty of times in my life," Silas told the board, voice steady. "Angry enough to do damage with it if I'd let myself. But I learned a long time ago, on a hillside I still can't name out loud, that the men worth remembering aren't the ones who burn the world down getting even. They're the ones who stay and fix what's broken and let the truth do the heavy lifting instead of their own fists. He looked directly at Cyrus Halloran, seated pale and rigid at the respondents' table. Mr. Halloran, I don't know what made you decide 3 acres of scrubland mattered more than 5 old men's lives and a child's safety. But I hope, somewhere down the line, you get the chance a boy gave me for free. The chance to be better than the worst decision you ever made. Cyrus Halloran resigned his position before the board could vote on his removal. The federal case against him proceeded regardless, moving through the slow machinery of consequence that Silas's testimony had helped set in motion. Not vengeance, but accountability, delivered without cruelty and without mercy either. Simply the truth allowed to do what truth does when nobody stands in its way. What the wound was really about. That evening, back at the trailer, Silas Vandergriff sat on Adwoa Boateng's front step with a cup of her cardamom-spiced tea going cold in his weathered hands, watching Kasi practice one-handed wheel changes on his bicycle in the gravel lot, bandages finally off, palms healed to thin pink scars that would fade to nothing within the year, but that Kasi would, quietly, always know were there. You know, Silas said, your grandfather used to say something to me back in country. Only time I ever heard him talk about anything close to feelings. We were pulling a long watch, waiting on a convoy that was running late, and I asked him. I was young, scared, hadn't seen enough yet to know better than to ask a question like that. I asked him if he was scared of dying out there. Adwoa, sitting beside him with her own tea, went still, listening. He told me he wasn't scared of dying, Silas continued. Said the only thing that scared him was dying without having stayed for somebody who needed him to. Said his own daddy back in Kumasi used to tell him that a man's whole life gets measured, in the end, by the moments he had the chance to run and didn't. Adwoa closed her eyes. She had heard almost those exact words, nearly verbatim, spoken to her own son 20 years later, in a driveway in this very desert, a man passing down a philosophy he'd carried out of a war and into a whole quiet lifetime of fixing broken things for people who couldn't pay him properly and never once asking for more than gratitude in return. He said the same thing to Kwabena, she whispered. Word for word, near enough. I always thought it was just a saying. Something families pass down without really meaning anything specific by it. It meant something specific, Silas said quietly. It meant everything. And your grandson just proved it means something 3 generations deep, in a stranger's burning garage, with nothing but a rusted crank and a heart too big for his body. Down in the gravel lot, Casey looked up from his bicycle, catching them watching him, and for the first time since his father died, something in his face wasn't just quiet, it was something closer to whole. Preacher, he called out. You think the club's really gonna come? 1,000 riders like Duke said? Silas Vandergriff smiled, the first full, unguarded smile anyone in that yard had seen on him since before the fire. Son, he said, when word gets out that a boy paid a 57-year-old debt without even knowing he owed it, riders come from further than you'd believe. You just wait. He was not exaggerating. 200 miles away in Oakland, a chapter president named Odessa Marchetti Van was already pulling her club's calendar and canceling a scheduled ride to make room for a different one. In Bakersfield, in Barstow, in towns up and down the spine of California and clear out to Nevada and Arizona, phones were ringing with the same 3 words that had started it all. Ride for Kasi. The desert highway that usually only hummed with strangers going somewhere else was about to fill up, shoulder to shoulder with people coming specifically for him. The morning it happened, Kasi woke before his alarm, the way he always did on days that mattered, and lay still for a moment listening to the desert quiet. The wind turbines humming faint on the ridgeline, a rooster 3 lots down that never seemed to know what time it actually was, his grandmother already up and moving in the kitchen, tambourine set carefully on the counter because today wasn't a Sunday, but it was, in its own way, a kind of church. 6 weeks had passed since the fire. 6 weeks since a rusted crank and a boy's bare hands had changed the shape of more lives than he could have imagined that Saturday morning, pedaling out towards smoke he should have pedaled away from. In those 6 weeks, Cyrus Halloran's federal case had moved into formal prosecution, the county had passed emergency legislation tightening oversight on fire mitigation budgeting, and the 3 acres of scrubland that had nearly gotten 5 men killed for the sake of a truck stop deal had instead been quietly donated, under community pressure nobody had expected to be so effective, to the Iron Widows Riding Club itself, along with a modest county grant for rebuilding. Deputy Wade Kerrigan had completed the department's new bias awareness training not as a punishment handed down from above, but as the first volunteer to sign up for it, and had since made a habit of stopping by Miss Ruthie's diner most Saturday mornings, not on duty, just present, slowly rebuilding a kind of trust that doesn't come back overnight and shouldn't. Marlon Beaufort Kite still worked the overnight traffic desk. Jendaye Fontaine's piece had been picked up by 2 national outlets and nominated for a regional journalism award, and she'd started at Adwoa's invitation, attending services some Sundays at Mount Zion Deliverance, not out of professional obligation, but because she'd found something in that community she hadn't known she was looking for. And Silas Vandergriff had spent 6 weeks doing something he'd never quite let himself do in 57 years, of carrying a debt he didn't know how to repay. He'd let himself become part of a family that wasn't his by blood, but had somehow, through fire and grief and an old letter never sent, become his anyway. For the rebuilding. The new garage went up on the same footprint as the old one. Silas had insisted on that, over the mild objections of a county planner who thought a fresh site might be more efficient. Some things need to stay where they started, he'd said, so folks remember what they're standing on. The corrugated steel was new, gleaming, painted a deep forest green instead of the old faded gray, and above the roller door, in letters cut from salvaged sheet metal by Duke Okafor's own careful hands, a sign had gone up that made Adwoa cry the first time she saw it, standing in the gravel lot with Cassie's hand in hers. Boating Reyes Hall, home of the Iron Widows Riding Club. 2 men, Silas had explained to her the day they'd unveiled the sign. Your husband and your son who both understood something most folks never learn in a whole lifetime. That staying costs you something, and you do it anyway, because the alternative costs more. He'd looked at Cassie, standing quiet and solemn beside his grandmother. And now, a third. The manual crank, the actual crank, rusted and bent and blood-stained from that Saturday morning, had been carefully removed from the old wreckage, cleaned and mounted in a glass case just inside the new garage's entrance, alongside a photograph of Kwame Boateng in his army uniform, and, beside it, the letter he'd written and never sent, framed now, finally delivered 57 years late to exactly the man it had always been meant for. Silas had read that letter for the first time in the garage's half-finished frame, 3 weeks after the fire, with Duke and Whistler and Ray and Tio standing silent behind him, and he'd had to stop twice to compose himself before he could finish it out loud. I hope somebody in his life knows what kind of man was riding beside him. I know now, Silas had said, once he could speak again, folding the letter carefully back along its soft, worn creases. 57 years too late. But I know now. The morning the highway filled up. Cassie had expected, when Silas first told him about the ride, that it would be modest. Maybe the 5 Iron Widows, maybe a handful of friends from neighboring clubs, 20 bikes, 30 at the outside, rolling in to mark the reopening of the garage that now bore his family's name. He was not prepared for what actually came down Route 138 that Saturday morning. It started as a low hum on the wind, felt before it was heard, the kind of vibration that travels up through the soles of your feet before your ears fully register the sound. Adwoa noticed it first, standing on the porch of the new garage in her good church dress, tambourine in hand, because Silas had specifically asked her to bring it. She put a hand to her chest. "Kasim," she said, voice unsteady. "Baby, come here. Come look at this." The hum became a rumble. The rumble became a roar that rolled across the high desert like weather, like the fire itself had rolled 6 weeks earlier, except this time it was bringing something toward them instead of driving something away. They came in formation, chapter by chapter, club by club. The Iron Widows in front, Silas Vandergriff at the head astride a machine he'd kept polished to a mirror shine for exactly this occasion, and behind them, stretching back along Route 138, as far as the eye could follow the curve of the highway into heat shimmer and distance, wave after wave of motorcycles. Riders from Barstow and Bakersfield, riders from Oakland, Odessa Marchetti Van's chapter arriving en masse, patches from a dozen different clubs Cassie had never heard of. Riders from as far as Nevada and Arizona, some of whom had left before dawn to make the ride in time. Veterans motorcycle associations. Church motorcycle ministries from 3 different denominations. A contingent of Jamaican and Trinidadian riders out of a Caribbean Cultural Association in Los Angeles, flags snapping from their sissy bars, who'd heard the story through a cousin of a cousin and decided a debt of honor like this one deserved witnesses from every corner of the diaspora that understood exactly what it meant. They kept coming and coming. County sheriff's deputies, Wade Kerrigan among them, Off duty, standing at the roadside not to direct traffic but simply to watch, hat over his heart, had to eventually close a full mile of the highway just to accommodate the sheer volume of engines rolling in. By the time the last rider parked and killed his engine, the tally the local paper would print the following week, carefully counted by Jendai Fontaine herself, standing at the roadside with a hand clicker counter and tears she didn't bother wiping away, came to 1,043 motorcycles. 1,043 riders, most of whom had never met Cassie Boateng Reyes in their lives, who had crossed hundreds of miles of desert highway for one reason, because a boy had refused to leave 5 strangers to die, and in a world that gives people plenty of reasons to believe kindness doesn't travel far anymore, they'd wanted to prove, together, all at once, engine to engine, that it still does. The door. The ceremony was simple because Silas had insisted it be simple. No stage, no microphones beyond what was needed for the small crowd to hear. No spectacle beyond the spectacle, 1,000 motorcycles parked shoulder to shoulder in the desert already provided on its own. Cassie stood at the base of the new garage's roller door, freshly painted, gleaming, the manual crank installed as a permanent fixture this time, not a forgotten backup system rusting from disuse, but a deliberate choice, mounted proudly alongside the electric motor as a standing reminder that some things are worth being able to open by hand, no matter how advanced the world gets. Silas Vandergriff knelt in front of him in the gravel, the way he had knelt in front of that jammed door 6 weeks earlier, except this time there was no smoke, no fire, no fear, just an old man's weathered hand extended toward a boy who had, in every way that mattered, become something like a grandson to him. "You ready?" Silas asked, quiet enough that it was just between the two of them, even with 1,000 riders watching. Casey nodded. His hands, fully healed now, closed around the iron handle of the crank. The same motion, the same grip, the same effort his grandfather had modeled 57 years ago on a hillside half a world away, the same effort his father had modeled every time he fixed something broken in that garage back home, rather than throwing it away and buying new. He turned the crank. The door rose smooth and easy this time. No rust, no resistance, no smoke pouring out from underneath, revealing the interior of the new Boateng Reyes hall. Workbenches gleaming, motorcycles lined in neat rows, and on the far wall, illuminated by a shaft of morning light through the new skylight Duke had insisted on installing, the glass case holding the old crank, the photograph, and the letter. 1,000 engines went silent for exactly that moment. Then, all at once, 1,000 riders began revving their throttles in a single sustained roar of celebration that rolled out across the high desert like thunder with nowhere left to go but up. And Adwoa Boateng, standing beside the door in her good church dress, lifted her tambourine and began to play, voice rising clear and strong over the engines, singing the same hymn she'd sung every Sunday at Mount Zion Deliverance, since before Cassie was born. A hymn about staying the course and holding on and trusting that the Lord's timing, however long it takes, always arrives exactly when it's needed. Cassie stood in the doorway of a garage that bore his father's and grandfather's names, surrounded by 1,000 strangers who had traveled hundreds of miles because he had refused, on an ordinary Saturday morning, to leave 5 other strangers behind. And for the first time in 2 years, standing in that door with the crank still warm under his healed palms, the quiet in his chest didn't feel like grief anymore. It felt like being held. What Silas said later that afternoon, once the crowd had thinned to a manageable few hundred, once the barbecue smoke from Miss Ruthie's catering trailer had settled into the kind of lazy afternoon haze that means a celebration has found its comfortable, unhurried rhythm, Silas Vandergriff found Cassie sitting alone on an overturned crate near the edge of the lot, watching the last stragglers pack up their bikes. "You all right?" Silas asked, easing himself down onto a crate of his own. "Yeah." Cassie was quiet for a moment. "It's just a lot. All these people. For me. Not just for you," Silas said gently. "For what you did. There's a difference. Even if it don't always feel like one." He looked out at the lot, at the last few riders shaking hands, exchanging contact information, promising to keep in touch the way people do at the end of something that mattered more than they expected it to. "Your grandfather never got a day like this. Nobody threw him a parade for pulling me out of that truck. He just went home. Married your grandmother, raised your daddy, fixed folks' cars for whatever they could pay, and never told a soul what kind of man he'd been under fire. Some heroes don't get their day. They just get the quiet knowledge, carried alone, that they did the right thing when it counted." "Is that sad?" Cassie asked. Silas considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things Cassie asked him these days. "No, he said finally. I don't think it's sad. I think it's just what staying costs, most of the time. It doesn't come with parades. It comes with a rusted crank and split-open palms and a debt that might not get paid back for 57 years, if it ever gets paid back at all. Your grandfather did the right thing without ever knowing if it would matter to anybody beyond that one burning truck. That's the real courage. Today, he gestured out at the emptying lot, at the last engines rumbling to life and pulling out onto Route 138. Today's just the world finally catching up to say thank you. But the doing of it, the staying, that happened a long time before anybody was watching. That's what actually counts. Cassie thought about that for a long moment, watching the last of 1,000 motorcycles disappear down the highway into the long gold light of a desert evening. I think I understand, he said finally. You stay, because it's right, not because anybody's gonna see. That's exactly it, son. Silas put a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder, the same shoulder Deputy Kerrigan had once grabbed in suspicion, now resting under the hand of a man who had traveled 57 years and half a world to finally, properly, thank the family of the man who'd saved him. Your granddaddy taught your daddy that. Your daddy would have taught you that given the time. Way I see it, he did teach you, even without the years to do it in person. Some lessons pass down through blood whether a man's alive to say them out loud or not. The reflection. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over the high desert at the end of a day like that one. Not the heavy, grief-soaked quiet Cassie had carried for 2 years after his parents died, but a different quiet altogether. Full instead of empty. Earned instead of endured. That evening, standing in the doorway of Boateng Reyes Hall as the sun went down orange and gold behind the ridgeline, Cassie Boateng Reyes, 11 years old, hands healed, heart considerably less alone than it had been 6 weeks earlier, turned the manual crank one more time just to watch the door move under his own strength, just to feel that same iron handle that had once cost him blood now moving smooth and easy beneath his palms. Some debts take 57 years to come due. Some kindnesses skip a whole generation before they find their way back around. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't loud or dramatic at all. It's just refusing to run when running would be so much easier. Staying when staying costs something, because somewhere down deep, in blood passed down through people you never even got the chance to meet. You already know that's who you are. Kwame Boateng stayed for a stranger on a hillside in 1969 and never told a soul. Kwabena Reyes stayed behind the wheel of trucks that carried other people's whole lives across a country that didn't always see him, right up until a rock slide took him from a family that loved him more than words could carry. And on an ordinary Saturday morning, with smoke rolling toward him and every reasonable instinct telling him to run, an 11-year-old boy named Kasim Boateng Reyes turned a rusted crank until his palms split open, because somewhere in his blood, in the quiet grammar his father had taught him without ever using the word courage, he already knew the only thing that matters in a fire is whether you stayed. So here's the question, and it's not a small one. Is there a debt like that sitting quiet in your own family? A kindness somebody gave that never got properly thanked? A staying that never got its parade? Somewhere out there, right now, there might be a family who's been carrying a debt of gratitude for years, decades even, not knowing how to close the circle. And maybe all it takes is one letter, finally sent. One name, finally spoken out loud. If this story moved you the way it moved everyone who stood on that highway watching 1,000 engines go silent for one boy, share it. Tell somebody about the debts that outlive the people who owe them, and the grandchildren who end up paying them off without even knowing they were carrying the weight. And down in the comments, tell us, who in your life stayed when they could have run? We'd love to hear it.